Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to introduce you to Jennifer Manton. She is a fellow of the College of Law Practice Management and also the Chief Marketing and Business Development Officer for Kramer and Levin in New York. Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Debbie. And thanks for everyone that has signed on so far. Hopefully a few more people will be joining us. I am delighted to be able to curate this conversation today on, I think, what is a very critical and important topic for law firms today, and really for all organizations. And maybe one of the things that we can say thank you to COVID for is that it really shed the light on the importance of health and wellness, and why that requires the attention and the care and feeding that so many other aspects of our legal businesses receive. So as a member of the content generation committee for the college the past couple of years, I've had the opportunity to talk with peers about what are sort of the key issues or trends or market forces that we're eyeing. And I do believe this is the first time the college has been able to offer a programming on health and wellness. So I'm really pleased to be able to bring that today. So I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists. Today we have Jonathan Beitner, who is a certified coach and founder of Novo Professional Development. And I am going to go ahead and read your bios. They are very impressive. Jonathan is a certified coach and founder of Novo. He is a frequent speaker and author on topics related to the intersection of professional development and well-being. He helps individuals identify and achieve their goals and works with firms, law schools, and Fortune 500 companies and to help lawyers, students, and staff to be productive, happier, and healthier. As a co-creator of the American Bar Association's Well-Being Pledge, Jonathan has experience creating and implementing industry-wide initiatives to help lawyers and legal professionals thrive. He has previously practiced as a litigator at Jenner & Block and clerked for federal judges on the 6th Circuit and Eastern District of Michigan after graduating from the University of Michigan Law School. And we have Lisa Smith, principal consultant at Lisa Smith Advisory LLC. Lisa is also a former practicing lawyer and law firm executive. She's the author of the acclaimed memoir, Girl Walks Out of a Bar, which recounts her descent into and recovery from high-functioning alcohol and cocaine addiction in big New York City law firms. She also co-hosts the podcast Recovery Rocks and speaks frequently for law firms, law schools, bar associations, and many, many other organizations on substance use and mental health disorders in the legal profession. Jonathan and Lisa, welcome. So I think we should just dive right in. But before we do that, we don't have quite as many people, but we did have one question, if you wouldn't mind dropping it into the chat. We are curious to know if your firm has a formal wellness initiative in place right now. If you could just take a few minutes, a simple yes or no, or maybe in the works, your response. Great, I see a lot of yeses. Wonderful. Not formal, but focused. Thanks, Kim. All right, well, hopefully you're going to hear ways to further your wellness program and create even more value for it. And for those that have a focus, but maybe not a formal program, you'll get some great ideas on how to move that forward into a more formal initiative at your firm. So I'll start with you, Lisa. Why is wellness such an imperative for organizations in our, what hopefully soon will be our post-COVID world?
Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to everyone for having this panel and having me on it today. Now, as you mentioned, you said one of the kind of silver linings, if there are any, of COVID is that these conversations have come much more out into the open. What's going to be, and what we're starting to see coming back returning to work and after the last 2 years, is that the pandemic really took a further toll on legal professionals, on top of what had already been a crisis in the profession. So now more than ever, it is imperative. I think many of you, and I see that a lot of people, which is great, have well-being programs. So I'm guessing you're familiar with the numbers from the 2016 ABA Hazel and Betty Ford survey that showed the prevalence of substance use and mental health disorders in the profession. And subsequent study that came out this past May just showed those numbers accelerating even more. Not surprising. I think it's across all professions through the pandemic and across the country generally. But what that means, I think, and why this makes it all the more imperative is that having been away from our normal routine of in-person work and events and all of those things, there is sort of a new, people are coming back now. And I think it's a good time to sort of level set on where everybody is, because I think you're going to have a lot of people now who might be struggling with a substance use or mental health disorder that weren't previously, or people who have their issues have worsened over the course of the pandemic. So being able to come into going forward from this moment on with an acknowledgement that what was problematic before is even more problematic now. I mean, my thought is always to sort of see if you can, kind of take the pulse of your community to, to see how things stand. But yeah, I think even more awareness, and it's gonna take even more, because we don't. More will be revealed as we go along, but we know it's going to be an increased issue. Jonathan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I would echo everything that Lisa just said. And I also thank you, Jennifer, and to the college for inviting us here and for that warm introduction. I'm really excited. And personally, I'm excited to be on a panel with Lisa, who, as I told her during our plan, was an inspiration for me when I was making this pivot from practice into this professional development well-being space. So it's really exciting for me personally. Yeah, I think the big thing here is when we talk about well-being, right? One common way to think about it is the multidimensional framework of well-being that was adopted by the National Task Force on Well-being back in 2017. That entity is now the Institute for Well-being in the Law. And this was a multidimensional framework that looked at things like emotional well-being and physical and social, intellectual, spiritual, and occupational, 6. And if you think about the COVID pandemic, it has put stress on each one of those dimensions in really acute ways. And just to point out a few of them, there was a study that this was in year 1.5 of the pandemic, so it's probably only gotten worse, that almost half of people aren't sleeping as well. So it's like a physical well-being thing. Burnout numbers are through the roof, right? There was one this was the first summer of the pandemic that 75% of people were experiencing symptoms of burnout at work. And this isn't just in the legal profession, this is sort of writ large. When we talk about emotional well-being, we're thinking about stress, anxiety, things like that. And not just COVID, but the weight of all these other huge sort of momentous events that have been happening the last few years in parallel with COVID, whether that's the political turmoil from a few years ago, whether that's social unrest, whether that's the war in Ukraine. And so there's just so much going on that we just need to have more concerted efforts to bolster well-being, because like Lisa said, the numbers were very clear that there was a huge issue beforehand. And we know it's only gotten worse, especially as it relates to substance use and misuse and maladaptive coping mechanisms and things like that. And so, when I think about what's the imperative, a colleague of ours, Patrick Krill, who's very well known, he always talks about well-being as a strategic imperative. And I think the reason for that is, as lawyers and those of us in the legal profession, the value we give to our companies, to our clients, to our firms is what, 98% our mental acumen. I mean, there's maybe something else out there, but for the most part, it's keeping our minds working effectively and efficiently. And when we're talking about supporting well-being, that's a huge part of it. So, we could talk for hours about why this is important, but I'll leave it there.
Well, it begs another question from the audience. For those of you that have well-being initiatives, which was, I think, informally or formally, which I think is almost everyone on the Zoom, can you drop into the chat whether it originated before the pandemic, or did it really take shape during the pandemic? Because I can speak for Kramer Levin as you're answering that there were, I feel like we were in the formation process pre-pandemic, but it really took hold and got some real guide rails and meat around it and the focus that it deserved during the pandemic, particularly as we were looking to bring people back and we were starting to identify and figuring out how to mitigate a lot of the challenges that people were having. Everything from hate crimes in New York City to fear of public transportation, to, just physically coming back into a space where you might have not even feel your health and safety is secure. So it's great to see actually that so many of them have, we've got early pandemic, originated before, but increased focus during the pandemic. We've got a couple before, so that's great.
If I could just
yeah.
add on that, from what I've seen anecdotally, is that sort of pre-pandemic, the focus revolved more around the office, right? So there would be, many firms had a meditation room in the office. They had yoga on certain nights, things like that, where people could have access to that in the office. And I think what the pandemic did was create a situation where more firms looked around and said, how do we support people outside? What are we doing? And I've seen firms adding in, things like some of the apps that are mental health related, providing them to their people, being able to, think more about resources that are kind of putting the information and the tools into the hands of the individuals to take and use as they need, and less of it sort of out of what are we doing formally in the office.
I'm not sure we need to spend a lot of time on the business case of implementing a wellness initiative, but we can spend some time on the business case about why firms need to invest the resources to support that wellness initiative that they put in place, and give it, put their money where their mouth is, so to speak. So Lisa or Jonathan, maybe Jonathan, you want to start? You want to have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, like I said, so the same reasons that we were talking about before of why this is a strategic imperative will inform the business case for making sure that not only do you create something, but that you make it meaningful and impactful, right? Because there are definitely instances where entities would nominally put some stuff out here, but if it's not well supported, if it's not championed at the top, it can do harm actually, right? Like that it can sort of, people's attention span for this stuff isn't limitless, right? And so if you don't invest in high quality programming and in initiatives that are well thought out of how they'll be received and getting buy-in from all different stakeholders across the firm, I have seen firms, now this is, again, back pre-pandemic mostly, because like we've said, it really has shown a spotlight on why these things are. But if you have unsuccessful programming, it can turn people off. So I definitely think that there's a lot of reasons why you would want to invest in them. And all the reasons that Lisa and I were just speaking before to the last question are part of the business case, right? All of our value is our mental acumen. So safeguarding that is really important. But just to put some numbers around it, right? Things like presenteeism, which is where you're at work, but not actually able to work because your mind is either caught up with, anxiety and stress and some other stuff that's just taking up your mental bandwidth. Or you're worrying about caretaking or something like that, and absenteeism, where you're not actually in the office or not working, even if no one's in the office before, that just depression alone is associated with 2.2 days of absence from work and 7.5 days of presenteeism, presenteeism, where you're present but not really working. Per worker, that's the average per worker, and this is not in the legal profession, but writ large. And so safeguarding against things like that, problematic drinking, the economic burden of alcohol use is estimated to be over 250 billion per year. The economic burden of depression is estimated at over 210 billion a year. So And those are kind of worldwide numbers. So there's huge numbers there. But the other big pressing issue that everyone I'm sure in the legal space is familiar with right now is retention, right? Recruiting and retention. And the turnover rate is just astounding. And there's been more studies that come out every day. Reuters, Thomson Reuters came out with a study that suggested that some firms are at risk of losing 125% of their associates over the next 5 years. And when you think about that, you might say that that's impossible. How could you do that? The answer is that there's so high turnover that you actually will end up churning through more than the total number you have right now. If you are, one of these firms that have characteristics of what they refer to as go firms, right, where that are losing a lot of people. And there were numbers associated with this that this was pre-pandemic, that firms lose roughly 9.1 billion in turnover costs. And that the average cost when an associate leaves is 400,000. I mean, I think those are probably all outdated and before all these crazy salary jumps and signing bonuses and things like that. So just from a retention standpoint, this stuff is really important. And just anecdotally, and then I'd love to hear Lisa's thoughts on this as well. But just anecdotally, I was at a conference around professional development. We were talking about burnout programming. And a woman raised her hand and said, I could get anybody to do a program on burnout. And then they lost every associate in their corporate department. And then all of a sudden they were interested in learning more about burnout and its consequences. So the idea that you would be ignoring well-being, particularly as it relates to burnout, especially at this point in time, with the legal market the way it is, would just be foolhardy, I would say. And so luckily with the pandemic and sort of the growth of the attorney well-being movement such as it is, I think that the arguments have started to dissipate. And it's more, how do we do this as opposed to whether we do it at all. But those are just some kind of high level numbers things to think about when you're trying to make the business case for getting more investment behind these initiatives.
Yeah, I would. Thank you, Jonathan. That is so spot on. The only thing I would add to that is there is also a risk management piece.
Yes, thank you.
And particularly with the substance use issues, I was practicing back in the early 90s. And I remember at that time, there would be, you might know that this partner down the hall, you get him in the morning because he goes and has a few drinks at lunch, and then you don't really want to get him in the afternoon. And people looked the other way. And it was very much like, that's his business. His clients love him. We don't get involved in personal lives. And, that's a strategy, but that's also a big risk, right? Because if you take someone like me, I stopped practicing before I got too senior. I shifted over onto the business side of the firm I was at. But, I was, by the end, it got worse for me later after that shift. But by the end, I was somebody you would call high functioning. I showed up, I got everything done. I never even got a negative comment in a performance review. In fact, the month before I checked myself into a hospital for a detox, I had gotten a really nice raise and bonus. But the truth is, the idea of high functioning is a myth, because you're high functioning exactly until the day you're not. The day you get a DUI, the day you make a mistake on a deal, the day you sleep through a court date, something like that. It's so from a business perspective, this is also a risk management issue as well. And you're not going to catch everybody who's struggling. It's just not possible. But there is an impetus that if you feel like there is a struggle going on, that you try to reach out and do something, just making the resources available for that person to get some help.
Do you have a sense, either of you, I don't know if there's an industry formula, in marketing and business development, you often look to have your budget be 2 to 3% of firm revenue. And that, thankfully, that's been increasing. I don't know, is there some sort of target or something that we should be looking at as an industry to invest in our employees to support this types of programming and support and resources? Anyone aware of anything?
I'm not aware of any particular sort of benchmark, but the way I see it as a spend from the firm's perspective would likely be, it kind of covers all bases, right? So, things that would fall, that might not technically be considered wellness programs, but are important to maintaining wellness, might relate to, kind of the more interpersonal strategies that you use when you're on a big deal or a big case. You know what I mean? I think it can touch a lot of things, providing this kind of programming that, when I go in and speak, it's generally under the professional development budget, or maybe it's under the HR budget. So I think it crosses a lot of the buckets.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm not familiar with, but it's a great question. And I've actually never heard anybody ask, like, what is an appropriate budget for this kind of stuff? And I think that's probably because those of us, we're just trying to get our foot in the door, and now that's more established, this is a better question to be asking. And I don't think that there's one right answer on, like, here's the dollar amount that you need to be spending in order to be successful, because there's good money spends and there's not, good returns. And so I think it really depends on your entity and the type of engagement you already have, and making sure that whatever you do invest resources in, that there's buy-in, there's support for, that you're going to get attendance, that you're going to get people to use the apps, or whatever it is that you're doing. And also, as Lisa said, definitely taking advantage of resources and spends that are already allocated. Because when you think about well-being more holistically, like I mentioned at the beginning with this multidimensional approach, you'll see that almost everything has a well-being component to it, and particularly departments that are already very well established, whether they're HR, professional development, diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's huge parallels and intersections between all of these topics with well-being. And so, I don't know what the best is from, like, a budgeting standpoint. Obviously more resources is better, but more so the process by which you go through to figure out how you're going to use that spend, I think, is where you can get the more efficiency and a better ROI on your investment.
Well, we had a question from one of the participants of what a best practice program looks like. So let's say you have your budget. What do you put together with that money? What does that program look like? What are the components of it?
Yeah, I'll throw some suggestions. So again, it's such a broad topic, right? When you're talking about wellness, particularly wellness, right? I mean, mental health, substance use is a bit more narrow, a bit more specific. But you've got to think about where is it going to be received, and where is it going to be internalized, and what's going to be most effective. And so it's less about the specific program, like, oh, I do a program titled X, and this is like a really good program. I could give you an answer on some topics and things like that, but what's most important is getting buy-in from people. And so I think how you go about deciding what you're going to offer needs to be, if it's for associates, you should get associate buy-in and some reflection from them on what would be useful. I generally am a proponent of giving these resources both broadly and deep, right? And what I mean by that is you want to make sure that everybody has access to resources, whether that's internal or like on an internet page or things like that. But when it comes to programming, I find that it's most effective if it's somewhat smaller, or around a certain, like, affinity group or things like that. So I think junior associates absolutely need this stuff, because so much about what I work on in particular is about, like, habit formation and things like that. And so the earlier you get that stuff into people, the better off they'll be, because you don't have to break habits and start new ones and things like that. But, one of the things that COVID has really done is put a lot of pressure on caretakers. And so if your firm or organization has, like, an affinity group for working parents, like, that's a really good population through which to deliver resources that are more tailored to them. So those are some ideas. Lisa, do you have anything you?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And they do have to be, I think, the most effective. Also, I totally agree with Jonathan, is when you have smaller, more targeted, directed programming within affinity groups, to make sure that there is inclusion. And it's definitely not here we're rolling out this one size fits all, or here we've got this new, we've got this new app that you all have access to. Here's how to use it. And this is why I think it's a constant conversation, not just at the top of the people who are leading these efforts, but all the way through. And that goes to what Jonathan was saying about buy-in. I think when we're rolling these things out, it has to be that there is buy-in, not just at the management committee level or executive committee level and the head of HR, but it's got to be with all of the different affinity groups with all of the different programs to reach the right, there's different solutions for different concerns and different issues that arise. And part of what is so essential to this is getting the buy-in from the leaders of various groups and helping them with effective communication and effective ways to keep it top of mind. I think a lot of what happens is, there will be a general firm rollout, but then it doesn't get carried into the discussions in separate groups later, in individual groups later on throughout the process. It just kind of sits there. And I think one of the things administrators do, and we tried to do when I was at the law firm, was to just script it for people, like educate, sort of like training the trainer, right? Like sitting down with the heads of the affinity groups and talking about, how can we most effectively get this rolled out to help your people.
Well, and I'll just share at Kramer Levin something that we did. We rolled it out in the first quarter, and to me, it seemed very novel. Everyone gets a business development spending allowance at our firm from the first year associate on up until you become a partner. I'm happy to report now they get a wellness spending account, and they get $1,000 a year individually to spend. And can't recall off the top of my head who administers the program. A third party does it through us, but they can spend it on everything from a new pair of sneakers to yoga classes to a health app to even a new mattress to blackout shades because it would promote better sleep. I mean, the list is really endless. Food delivery services that, like, for people that want to eat healthy but don't have time to cook, you could spend your allowance on that. So I'll look forward to reporting back. And as I am told, I asked before this call, we've had about 60% of the people already take advantage of their spending allowance. So that's one way to really take it to the individual and have it be completely customized to their needs.
Yeah, that's a great initiative. I had not heard.
I love that.
One thing I would also add just to this idea of like what makes an effective program is how do you make it part of it's great. One-off programming. Look, I mean, I've got a hot hour on topic X, like great, good. But there's only so much that a one-off program can do, right? And so what we've seen among some of the entities that have taken a really robust approach to this stuff as it relates to signing the pledge and their commitments under the pledge is that it's a theme that runs for the whole calendar year throughout many different entities and departments and things like that. And it'll be like, okay, each month or every 2 months, there's a theme or a dimension of well-being that's focused on, and that there are multiple things that touch on that theme, whether it's programming that's kind of standalone, whether it's integrating things into your kind of day-to-day to support physical well-being, right? Whether it's a steps challenge or it's things like that, or it's organizing informal exercise classes amongst people in the firm, or whatever it might be. There's lots of different ways to do it, but if you make it as systemic as possible, that's going to be more successful because it will demonstrate a sustained commitment as opposed to a one-off or a box checking exercise or things like that.
Right. Let's switch gears a little bit to the stigma of mental health and how we can overcome that or reduce that. Obviously, it seems that the more attention we put on the importance of mental health and wellness will help to achieve that. But we at the firm are participating in Mental Health Awareness Month, which I guess is the month of May. And again, just this morning, I got a whole email from our HR department, and I see that they're actually holding a webinar by a licensed clinical therapist who will host a well-being webinar discussing the stigma around therapy and how to overcome it. So I thought, well, that's on point. And honestly, I don't think you would have seen that type of programming pre-pandemic. I really feel like we're riding a really good wave here right now.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in on stigma. That is, first of all, I love that program. That's such a great, and I don't know if I think about it as having had my professional career in New York City, where it seemed like everybody talked about their therapist. but that's huge. And stigma, going back to the 2016 study, when you look at the numbers and the people who responded that they were in fact struggling with a substance use or mental health disorder, when asked why they didn't seek help for that, there were two answers far and away, blew away the rest. One was, my colleagues will find out, I don't want my colleagues to know because then they'll think less of me. And two, you tell me that these resources you give me are confidential, but I don't really believe that. And I think my information is going to get out, and then we're back to one. So stigma is what kills. Stigma is what keeps people out of getting the help they need. And a lot of the work that I do is around trying to break that stigma. I mean, I think that this was what was important to me when I was coming out with my book, when I was encouraged to take a pen name or fictionalize it, I was like, no, the reason I want this out there is because I want the next person who's dealing with what I dealt with to know they're not alone. So it had to be me, my name, and raising my hand and saying, this is what it looks like. This is, what it is. And the more that there are people doing that, the better it is. And I have to say, I think that there's a couple things to it. One is that my career actually took off when I got sober 18 years ago. So, showing people that there is something better on the other side can erase some of that fear, but also and I think the pandemic has helped in a big way in terms of talking about these things much more openly. And I would say, like, I've been surprised. I was presenting to one firm, that was big top firm. And at the end, when I was taking questions, one of the partners got on and said, it's a senior partner in this very prestigious firm, says, I just want everyone to know that I am in recovery from addiction, from alcoholism. I have been for 25 years, and my door is open if you need to talk. And it was like that kind of thing. Then that was spontaneous, so we're out there, and the more people can speak up within their organizations, I think is great. But yeah, I think showing that, and also just having, and also respecting the fact that I think it's very important. Everyone's story is their own, right? I mean, everybody who gets sober like me does not need to come out and start screaming from the rooftops. It's a very personal thing. And so having those resources available that you can be assured are confidential, and that you can feel comfortable using, and not feeling like you must be compelled to be, out there talking about it, I think is important.
Yeah, I mean, this is something, it's very interesting. There's no doubt that stigma was it remains, and was certainly one of the top barriers to this type of programming and initiatives, and taking advantage of the resources that we're talking about. There's no doubt about that. Lisa mentioned that in the 2016 study, there was data. There was a similar study that came out around the same time as that 2016 ABA Hazelden study that looked at law students, and same kind of stuff, saw very similar disturbing trends. But one of the data points from that study that always stuck with me the most was that 63% of respondents from the law student survey said that they would not get help for these issues because they were afraid it would affect their job or academic standing. And so that's a huge, huge part of it. And just also anecdotally from the signatories of the ABA's pledge, we ask them every year to report on what they've been doing and the challenges they've been seeing. The good news here is that the first year we did it, almost every single entity listed stigma and obtaining buy-in as major hurdles, and that those numbers have plummeted in the last. This is year 3 of the pledge. I forget right off the top of my head, but only 3% said getting buy-in from like the top was like a serious issue, and so I think that shows, and significantly fewer people said stigma, whereas it was almost uniform before. So I think there has been progress being made. There's a lot of more infrastructure to talk about these things, whether it's kind of more paternalistic things like CLE requirements. I'm based in Chicago, and Illinois has a mental health substance use CLE requirement. The ABA just issued new standards for accrediting law schools that will require some more stuff at that level. So those things like the pledge, things like next week is going to be Wellbeing Week in the Law, which is an initiative created and organized by the Institute for Wellbeing in Law. So there's a lot more stuff. I mean, this stuff is just, to say it's more prevalent now than it was 5 years ago, I think would be a grotesque understatement. And so I think we're making progress on the stigma front, but there are some things that within your organizations you can do to kind of get more bang for your buck as it relates to stigma reduction. And there's actually some studies. There was a meta study that looked at like different stigma reduction efforts across the globe. This was like dozens of countries. And they looked at 3 types of different anti-stigma reductions strategies. Education, where you just give people a lot more information about the stuff. What they refer to as contacts, where people had contact with someone who was dealing with the issue that you're trying to destigmatize. And then protest stuff, which was a little bit weird. And it would be like protesting the way mental health is depicted on TV. That would be like an example of one of these interventions. And by far and away, contact was the most successful at reducing stigma. And what that meant was having and hearing from someone. I mean, it's one of the reasons why Lisa's book and her work is so impactful, because she, people can see themselves in her story, right? And what they found was there's a couple of things that make contact interventions more successful. One, when they're in person. Obviously, we've gotten away from that a bit, but in person is a little bit better than video or recorded stuff, pre-recorded stuff. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting for the law firm and legal organizational setting is the relationship between the speaker and the audience. So the closer that the speaker is to the audience, the intended audience, the more successful the intervention is. And that actually goes, I want to touch on Gavin's question in the chat, right? That speaking that many people in this space tend to be white women, as he mentioned. And so, it's important to keep in mind that if you're going to have the most bang for your buck in these programs and initiatives, to get the speaker to be more associated or closer to the audience, right? And that means bringing in people from different backgrounds and perspectives. And that's something the Institute of Wellbeing in the Law, I think, has a database of diverse speakers on these topics. So that's a resource you can check out. Looking around on LinkedIn, if someone wants to reach out to me, I have a list of colleagues that are from different diverse backgrounds that I'd be happy to recommend. But that's an important piece of it, right? And so, that's why getting someone who's been a big law associate to talk to associates can be more effective, because it's just the buy-in comes more easily, more readily. Whether that's justified or not, or is a good thing or a bad thing, it's just a fact that this meta study showed. So that's something else to keep in mind when you're creating these initiatives.
So a lot of the things that you both just talked about, I think, do speak to how do you embed wellness in the culture of a firm, but some of these things are big things. Do you have any specific, like just small tactical things? I guess one thing that comes to mind is that we always make sure that not every event we do isn't around alcohol, or if it is serving alcohol, that we have a mocktail option. But do you have other little things, particularly for those that are in the marketing and business development space, where we are often creating engagement opportunities for our clients, or heavily involved in internal engagement, any small tips you want to share? And I want to be mindful of the time, and I do want to give some time to the personal well-being tips. So maybe we just spend a couple of minutes on this. But
I can talk about that a little bit. So yeah, I would say, having come from business development and doing all of that, I think this is one of the big things when you talk about alcohol that we need to keep in mind is, as I mentioned, and as Jonathan mentioned before, people are coming in with all kinds of things that we just don't know. And the culture has always been in the legal world that alcohol equals fun, right? You can't have it, and it's a little bit more than like, you can't have an event. An event's not fun if you don't have alcohol, but it's more like event. It's not fun if you're not drinking, which is a little bit of a different thing. So I think, and also coming in on including everybody there, coming back on a wellness thing when you're talking about planning an event, is starting from the very outset of planning that event, recognizing that there are going to be people there who don't choose to drink because, one, they may be taking medication, two, they may be sober like me, they may be on a diet, they may be religious, they may be training for something. There's all kinds of reasons. So how do we just make it more inclusive. And there are, I'm happy to provide anyone with a great kind of like, if you're doing it with Diet Coke and club soda, you're doing it wrong in 2022. And there are so many great options, but I'll give you one anecdote of an easy thing. When I was at the firm I was at until 2019, they had me, and my book had been, they were so wonderful to me at Patterson Belknap, and they had supported everything I did. And they also and I sat on their management committee, and they were supportive of this whole thing. So I was very fortunate when I could go in and say, listen, we were having our 100th anniversary, and it was a very fancy event at the Rainbow Room, 300 people coming, clients, alums, all the attorneys. And we did, like Jennifer said, a signature cocktail, which was a pomegranate margarita. And then we also had available, as we always had, because they had had me for so long, a mocktail available. But instead of having that mocktail at the bar, where you had to kind of get through and get it, when we had it so that when you walked in, there was a tray of pomegranate margaritas, and you could get like sparkling water or whatever, but there was also a tray of virgin mojitos. And instead of having to go to the bar, and just having that at the door, they flew. It was unbelievable. And I had a client come up to me and say, just want to really thank you guys for making that so easy, because I wanted to come, I wanted to celebrate, I was planning on having a drink. I figured I'd have a drink, but it's Tuesday night. I'm commuting home, and I'm going to do math with my kid. Like, this just made it so much easier to feel like being part of the celebration without having to have a drink, which I wouldn't normally have today. So keeping in mind that some people aren't drinking because it's Tuesday, whatever it is, not everybody equates a fun time with drinking. So then if you build from there, it makes it a lot easier. And, not saying at all, don't have alcohol. The majority of lawyers can drink safely. I can't, they can, but to make it just as comfortable and just as many there's no excuse not to have good options for the people who choose on a given night to not drink.
I feel the same way about food, and, the ice cream social on Administrative Professionals Week, where this year we had like a whole smoothie bar in the morning and different granolas and fresh fruits. We were still having ice cream, but there was the healthier option in the morning. So, but those are the things that I do think help to shape a culture of wellness, because they start becoming embedded in the fabric of the firm. It really is the little things as much as it is the calendar of programming, or, recognizing Mental Health Awareness Month or whatever.
Yeah, I would just add to that and just put some numbers at. So the studies show that a third of people almost a third, 30% of people don't drink. And that's just in the States, and globally it's a much larger number. And so there's a myriad of reasons why that is the case. And so thinking of ways as an inclusion issue, right, that people feel. And so as far as embedding, I just like high level stuff, right? Make sure things are evidence-based, make sure that you're getting buy-in across all levels, make sure you have champions at the top, make sure you're coordinating with other departments, right? Whether it's HR, marketing, professional development, DEI. And then the other thing I would say is leveraging existing expertise, right? So there are some firms that a partner is really into meditation, so they run a meditation thing in the morning, and they invite clients, and it becomes a business development thing. Or someone's really into journaling, and they want to share what they do, or whatever the case may be. Finding expertise within your firm, because that will also help build a sense of community and show that it's in some ways already embedded. But just to also add a few smaller things, particularly as it relates to marketing and programming and event planning. So one thing is to the extent you have a well-being committee or something like that, make sure that the marketing folks and the people who are in charge of planning and administering events are involved in that, because obviously they're going to have a big role to play in making sure that we're implementing the strategies that Lisa just mentioned. The other thing is to think about how we communicate things. There are firms that have, gotten rid of the term happy hour, and it'll be social gathering or social event or stuff like that. Or one firm that has instructed their marketing department not to have imagery of alcohol on anything. And just little things like that can help move the needle. Another small thing that helps embed things is, having, when you give introductions or you use bios, having how that person engages self-care be part of that. It's just like a really small thing. Or including centering exercises in like regular team meetings, or just making sure people connect in ways that are not solely about work. And that goes to a larger theme of creating an environment that fosters and cultivates psychological safety amongst your staff and attorneys. And that idea of having a psychologically safe space where people feel comfortable being vulnerable, people feel comfortable opening up, making mistakes, or suggesting ideas that they don't know for sure are right, is good, not just for well-being, but also for business, right? That is how you have effective teams. That is how younger attorneys add value, right? They don't just keep their nose down and stay quiet. So those are the suggestions that I would offer.
And clients notice when a team likes each other, when you're working together, when you go out on a pitch, whatever it is. If you've done these kinds of things and made people feel like a team and feel like a community, that shows, and that does impact how clients see us.
And we'll also blunt the turnover, the rash of turnover issues the whole industry's been seeing as well.
Great. I don't think we've gotten any more questions, but maybe Jonathan, if you want to share some personal well-being tips, and I would invite those to drop into the chat, any other questions, and hopefully maybe we'll get to them before the top of the hour.
Yeah, sure. So some just high-level well-being tips, and each one of these we could talk about for days and days and days. So if anybody who wants to talk more, feel free to reach out. But high-level stuff, and we've talked about some of these things, taking a holistic or multidimensional approach, a wider view of what it means when we're talking about well-being and wellness, right? So often we limit it to not suffering from things like depression, anxiety, not having a substance use issue. But really the goal is to be thriving in these different dimensions of our lives. So taking a wider view and thinking about different ways in which our actions impact those different dimensions I had mentioned at the beginning can be really helpful. Another thing that's really I find very important in my own self-care practices is finding ways to engage in what's referred to as affect labeling. And affect labeling is simply the process by which we articulate our thoughts, feelings, and emotions and put them into words. And that is a really therapeutic thing for many different ways, but it helps us process negative emotions and engages different parts of our brains that make us a little less reactive to what we're thinking and feeling, and can give us space to kind of move forward with intentionality and in a productive and solution-oriented way. So engaging in affect labeling, and that can look a lot of different ways. You can just talk with a friend or a family member, right, about how things are going. You could talk to a therapist or a coach. You could do journaling exercise, right? It doesn't have to be with someone else necessarily, but just finding ways to put into words what you're thinking and feeling is really important. Finding ways to foster more positivity and optimism. It's more specifically taking time to habitually recognize positive events and express gratitude. Regularly engage in cognitive reframing, which is simply thinking about things in more than one way, is really great, because so often our first reaction to something is informed by pessimism and our own kind of fears and insecurities. And so we just want to make sure that we don't let that be the end of the analysis, and that we think kind of more broadly and from different perspectives. Practicing mindfulness, again, something we can talk about for days and days and days, but mindfulness is simply a state of awareness that arises when we pay attention in three ways. When we pay attention to the present moment, on purpose, non-judgmentally. And while meditation is often conflated with mindfulness, that's simply one way in which to practice mindfulness, but you can do anything mindfully. And then the last one is to cultivate self-compassion. And this is a big one, and something mindfulness is helpful for. That idea of being non-judgmental can be really big, but so often we're really critical on ourselves, and that does us no good. And one of the ways we can engage in cognitive reframing when we have negative thoughts, particularly about ourselves, is how would I respond if a friend of mine came to me with the same issue, right? So it's for many of us, it's much easier to be compassionate with others than it is with ourselves. And so that would be the last thing I would say. And there are studies that show two things. One, perfectionism tendencies that are on the rise and have been for the last 40 plus years. And that the best thing for breaking the correlated link between perfectionism and symptoms of depression is self-compassion. So that's the last tip I would leave you with.
I love every bit of that. It's all so true. And what I think what you've gotten to one of the big issues that I think those kinds of practices that you just talked about address is one of the really prevalent things I hear about all the time from attorneys, which is imposter syndrome. Everybody tends to feel like all eyes are on them and what they're saying and what they're doing and what is this person thinking about me, and I'm not enough, and that person just said something smarter than what I said, and the constant comparison. And I think that when we, and it's a negative story we tell to ourselves based on no facts, right? We have zero facts to support it, yet we can run away with it. And I find that those particular, and because it is such a seemingly universal thing. I know, for example, Tom Hanks struggles with imposter syndrome. So if Tom Hanks has it, everybody's got some, and it impacts certain people, particularly with perfectionism, really intensely. And so teaching the ability to sort of step out and reframe is huge. And we never would talk to, a friend the way we talk to ourselves. So I think that is probably like one of the biggest things that I see coming up. In terms of other practices, one of the things that I know can be hard because we all have time and time issues and constraints and everything, but even if it's just for a small amount of time, having some sort of hobby that is outside of the law and outside of your professional life, which is, for me, was writing, right? So I wrote my book every morning before I would go to work. Over the course of 10 years, I wrote in the mornings. And that morning was my favorite part of the day, that hour in the morning. And if I didn't do it a day, I didn't do it, and that was okay too. But finding something that gets you out of having so much of your identity wrapped up in your professional, in your professional standing, being more than just like, I am a lawyer at firm X, and even small hobbies, can, whether you engage in them regularly or not, it's almost a form of meditation. People do gardening, people do all kinds of, going back to playing a piano or doing something, taking a stand-up class, like whatever interests somebody is a great way to.
Books, another
what?
One. Adult coloring books, same kind.
Yeah. Totally. Anything to like get your mind out of, because it is very hard, I think, to break that constant conversation that's going on.
And I would just, because that's such a great one, the idea of a hobby and having something that can take us out of that normal kind of cycle of rumination about work. And this is something I often talk about with people who are skeptical about mindfulness, right? People will say, I don't like mindfulness, it's not for me. I'm really into racquetball. It's like, okay, well, what you like about racquetball is that while you're playing racquetball, you are unable to worry about the past and ruminate about the past and worry about the future, right? You are focused on the present moment because a racquetball is, zooming at you. Whether that's playing piano, whether that's doing coloring, whether that's playing sports, these hobbies act as mindfulness practices because they force us to focus on the present moment on purpose, non-judgmentally. And in doing so, to the exclusion of ruminating about the past and worrying about the future. And so, as Lisa said, it doesn't matter what it is, but getting yourself out of that type of thinking and into a more present moment headspace is going to be really beneficial. And that's why these hobbies are relaxing, because they let us put down the mental load we're carrying in the form of ruminating and worrying.
And one more, just the last one I would add that has been really important for me and that I learned in recovery is service, doing something for somebody else. As we say in recovery, when my head is a bad neighborhood, I have to get out. And the best way to get out is to call somebody who might be having a hard time, or just call somebody, we frequently say, check in with your healthiest friend because they may well be struggling, doing those kinds of things, or even participating in something, we did a lot at the firm, as I'm sure a lot of you do, in terms of, clothing drives, food drives, different kinds of things that are not about us, but can make us, there is a lot of good feeling that comes from helping the next person. And I think that is another thing.
And studies show that doing good deeds gives us a lot of benefits, and that's been known for a while. One of those benefits is it can help foster more positivity and optimism and impact our attitude, our outlook, and things like that. And so absolutely, that's a great one as well.
I feel like we could have done a whole hour on the personal tips because I want more. So those were very generous. both of you to share so much with us, and the hour went fast as we predicted. I don't see any more questions. So would either of you care to any final thoughts, and we'll let everyone go at 1 o'clock?
I'll just throw out, so the one thing I do the most, I mean, people ask me, I do journaling. I mean, that's the thing I do, and it incorporates a lot of these strategies. And I do bullet journaling, which, if you're not familiar with it, is just a series of headings and you fill them in with bullet points. So it's able to capture a lot of information really quickly. So if anybody's interested in learning more about that, happy to talk whenever, because I've been doing that for the last 3 years and it's been totally life-changing for sure.
One of the things that I found during the pandemic was the New York Art Institute offered online Zoom classes. So I did drawing and watercoloring, which has been transformative for me. And it sparked the artist in me that I hadn't thought about in 25 years, but they have a tremendous journaling class. And that's what I want to take next. So.
Very cool.
I love it. I would just add, the last thing I would add would be, and I think particularly for people like me in recovery, there's the spirituality component is really something that we don't talk about a lot, but that can really be helpful, whatever that looks like for you, you know, and there is no limit, but things that are make you feel connected to the world around you, to other people, and being able to, that brings a lot of that kind of practice. And along the lines of what you did during the pandemic, I started doing, I moved to California in 2019, and I have apparently gone full woo-woo because I now read tarot cards. So whatever
There's no wrong way to
boat,
do
I guess.
self-care, right? There's no
What?
No wrong way to do self-care.
No,
Exactly.
Well, thank you. And thanks to the small but mighty group we had listening in. I hope that you all got some good takeaways, and really appreciate you being here. And look out for the survey, the evaluation that we're going to send to you, and please pass the recording along. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was an
Really
honor.
appreciate it. Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
Take
Bye.
care.
Thanks, Debbie.